Compró un viejo tractor oxidado por solo $1, solo para decorar su patio. Pero cuando abrió el capó, lo que encontró dentro lo cambió todo. Suscríbete al canal y cuéntanos en los comentarios desde dónde estás viendo este video. Rain came down in a slow, deliberate lines, thin as needles and relentless as time itself. The cemetery had turned to gray mud underfoot, swallowing the heels of those who dared step too close to the grave. Umbrellas bent in the wind like wounded wings, the air so cold it made every breath appear like smoke. No one spoke much. Words seemed too fragile to survive the wet wind. A handful of relatives stood by, huddled together for warmth more than comfort, listening to the priest's voice fade into the steady hum of the storm. When the final clump of earth hit the coffin lid, the sound was deeper than it should have been, like the world sealing away something it was afraid might come back. Mia Lane stood slightly apart from the others, her black coat soaked through, the hem brushing the mud. She wasn't crying, but something hollow pressed against her chest, a weight without shape. Uncle Harold had never been a man of warmth or closeness, and yet his death left an odd emptiness, as though a door that had always been closed was now simply gone. Her mother, Karen, was beside her, holding a damp tissue, her eyes red not only from grief but from effort, the exhausting labor of appearing composed. When it was over, people drifted toward their cars, the smell of wet soil and cut flowers following them like a shadow. The cemetery emptied quickly. Only the rain stayed, unbothered, eternal. Karen lingered for a moment longer, staring down at the mound of earth. Her voice was nearly lost under the hiss of the storm. "He didn't deserve to die alone," she murmured. Mia nodded faintly, though she wasn't sure she agreed. Harold had chosen isolation like one might choose armor. For years he lived behind locked doors, windows covered with blinds, his world reduced to the size of his own silence. He attended family gatherings rarely, always sitting at the far end of the table, smiling politely at jokes he didn't seem to hear. A man half present, half elsewhere, and now entirely gone. The drive home wound through narrow roads at the edge of town. The trees bowed under the rain, and the fields looked drowned, as though the world were being quietly erased. Harold's property sat on the last bend before the hills began, a lonely house surrounded by crooked oaks and a sagging wire fence. Even through the mist, it had the air of something watching itself fall apart. Mia had known it since childhood. In summers, her parents would take her there for a day, trying to be kind to the uncle who didn't like company. The house had smelled of dust even then, and she'd always been drawn to the garage at the back of the yard, a tall, rusted structure with a heavy oak door and no windows. She could remember running toward it once, curious about what secrets it hid, only for Harold's voice to slice through the air, cold and sharp. "Stay away from there, Mia. That's not for you." She hadn't asked again. The tone had been more warning than anger, a kind of fear she didn't understand at the time. Now, sitting in the car as her mother pulled into the overgrown driveway, she felt that same chill return. The rain softened to a whisper. The house looked unchanged, the same drooping gutters, the same porch light burned out. A rusted mailbox leaned sideways by the gate, its nameplate still reading Harold Lane, in letters nearly dissolved by rust. Inside, the air was heavy, stale with the scent of dust, oil, and something faintly metallic. Karen switched on a light. It flickered uncertainly but held. "Well," she said, her voice thin, "it's time." They moved slowly through the rooms. Nothing had been touched since Harold's last day alive. Newspapers formed leaning towers beside the couch. Coffee cups fossilized with brown rings sat on coasters. Calendars were still pinned to a year long gone. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for permission to exhale. Mia trailed her fingers along a shelf filled with old photographs. Most were black and white, some in faded color. Harold as a young man by a lake. Harold in front of a factory. Harold beside strangers whose faces were lost to memory. In every image, he stood slightly apart, shoulders tight, eyes not looking at the camera but past it, into some other world. There was never a real smile, not even the faintest one. She followed the narrow hallway toward the back of the house and stopped. The air was colder there, damp. At the end of the hall stood the garage door, solid oak, darker than everything else. a heavy padlock hanging from a corroded latch. The sight of it gave her a strange sensation, as if she'd stepped too close to something alive. She reached out without thinking, her fingertips brushing the cold metal. "Leave that for later," her mother's voice came from behind her. Karen's expression was weary. "We'll deal with the garage another day. Lord knows what kind of junk he kept in there." Mia hesitated, glancing back at the door. "He never let anyone in, did he?" Karen shook her head. "Not even your father. He said it was his workspace, something important. But I think it was just another excuse to be alone. After your aunt left him, it got worse. Sometimes I'd call and he wouldn't answer for weeks. Then he'd show up at my door with some broken radio he wanted to fix, acting like nothing was wrong." The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet labor. They opened drawers full of receipts, folded clothes that still carried the faint smell of machine oil, and tried not to talk about the way the silence of the house seemed to deepen around them. By the time the rain started again, a thin, rhythmic tapping on the roof, both women were too tired to drive back. "Let's stay the night," Karen suggested. "One last time in this place. We can leave first thing tomorrow." They found some old candles in a kitchen drawer and lit them on the table. Over a dinner of canned soup and stale bread, the conversation drifted toward memories. Karen spoke of Harold's brilliance when he was younger, how he'd always been scribbling in notebooks or fixing cameras. "He had this phrase he used," she said, staring into the candle flame. "Truth takes time to ripen." I never knew what he meant by that. Maybe it was just another one of his oddities. Mia smiled faintly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. There was something unsettling in that phrase, something that sounded more like a warning than wisdom. After her mother went upstairs to sleep, she stayed at the table, listening to the wind creak through the trees. The candlelight trembled on the walls, throwing long shadows that made the room look deeper than it was. Through the window she could see the outline of the garage, its roof slick with rain. A single thought kept circling in her mind. If a man spent his whole life guarding a room, what could be so dangerous inside? When the clock struck midnight, a sound broke through the steady rhythm of the rain. Metal on metal, faint, irregular. Mia froze, the candle flame shivering beside her. There it was again, a rattle, like a chain moving against a latch. Her pulse quickened. She rose, crossed the room, and peered through the window. The yard was awash of gray under the storm, the grass moving like a sea. And there, barely visible, the padlock on the garage door was swaying gently, catching the porch light with each motion. The wind wasn't strong enough to do that. For a moment she thought she saw another light, brief, sharp, like a flashlight passing across the far fence. Then nothing. The dark seemed to swallow it whole. She slipped on her shoes and stepped outside before she could stop herself. The cold hit her instantly, cutting through her coat. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. She moved toward the garage, each step sinking slightly into the mud. The lock hung loose, not snapped shut as it had been earlier. The small keyhole glinted. She reached out and touched it. It swung open easily, as if someone had already turned the key. Her breath came shallow. The rain fell softly on her hair and face, a slow whispering sound like static. She turned her head toward the house. All the windows were dark except one upstairs where her mother slept, the curtain shifting with the draft. The lock was still in her hand, cold and slick. She didn't know why she did it, maybe out of fear, maybe instinct. But she closed the lock again and slipped the small key into her pocket. The distant thunder rolled across the hills. She turned away from the garage and walked back to the porch, her footsteps barely audible against the rain. Inside, the house felt warmer, but the air carried a strange weight, as if the walls had absorbed the sound from outside. She closed the curtains, blew out the candle, and sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room downstairs. The darkness was thick, the kind that seemed to hum faintly in the ears. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a loose latch, a trick of the storm, but she couldn't. The image of that swaying lock stayed fixed in her mind. Someone had been there, someone who knew where to find the key. When she finally lay down, the house moaned with the wind. Upstairs, her mother shifted in her sleep, and somewhere beyond the fence, unseen, a faint light blinked once, then vanished. The night swallowed everything, but Mia's hand never left the pocket where the cold shape of the key rested. as if the metal itself had a pulse. She closed her eyes, but her thoughts refused to still. If someone had come to open that door tonight, she thought, what were they hoping to find? Outside, the storm thickened again, and the first flash of distant lightning illuminated the yard, just long enough for her to see the garage one more time. For an instant, the rain looked like threads of silver, and in that silver she could have sworn she saw a shadow move behind the narrow crack beneath the door. Then darkness fell again, deep and absolute. Morning arrived as a dim, colorless thing, filtering weakly through the thin curtains and spilling onto the dusty wooden floor. The air inside the house felt stale, as though the storm had squeezed all the life out of it. Somewhere water dripped steadily, each drop echoing in the silence like a small reminder that time was still moving. Mia sat up slowly, her head heavy, her mind fogged by a restless night. For a few moments she couldn't tell if what had happened had been real or a dream. The lock, the movement outside, that flicker of light by the fence. But when her hand brushed against her pocket, she felt the small metal shape nestled there, cool against her fingers. The key was real. Her mother was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of papers and empty coffee cups. She looked up when Mia entered, a faint smile trying to find its way onto her tired face. "Did you sleep at all?" "Not much," Mia admitted. "Me neither. This place makes too much noise," Karen said. "Old pipes, the wind through the vents. Feels like it's breathing, doesn't it?" She tried to laugh, but the sound didn't last long. Mia poured herself some instant coffee, the kind that tasted like ashes, and stared out the window toward the yard. The garage stood there, solid and silent, its dark wooden door streaked with water stains. It looked almost like part of the landscape, a feature of the earth itself rather than a man-made structure. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had crossed its threshold. "We'll do one room at a time," Karen said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "The sooner we finish, the sooner we can get out of here. I don't think I could spend another week in this house." Mia nodded distractedly. She helped her mother pack old clothes and dishes into boxes, the repetitive work numbing her thoughts. Yet her gaze kept drifting back to the narrow hallway leading to the garage, as though something there was quietly calling her name. By late morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a washed-out light that made the world outside look thin and brittle. When Karen went upstairs to sort through the bedrooms, Mia found herself standing in front of the garage door again. The padlock hung there, still wet, rust-speckled and stubbornly silent. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the small key from her pocket. She hesitated, half expecting something to stop her. A creak from the floorboards above, her mother's voice, a gust of wind. But the house was quiet. She slid the key into the lock. It turned easily, too easily, as if the mechanism had been waiting. The sound of the latch releasing echoed faintly down the hallway. She took a breath that felt too deep, too loud in the silence, then pushed the door open. It resisted for a moment, the hinges groaning like a creature disturbed from hibernation. A cold draft spilled out, carrying with it the smell of dust, machine oil, and something older celluloid and wood, the ghost of film reels long forgotten. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through a small, grimy window near the ceiling. Dust drifted lazily in the air like pale smoke. It wasn't the chaotic mess she had expected. The garage was precise, orderly, every inch of space claimed and categorized. Shelves lined the walls, each packed with boxes and neat rows of VHS tapes, their spines labeled in Harold's exact handwriting. The handwriting itself was so meticulous that it almost looked printed, each letter identical to the last. Mia stepped inside carefully, her shoes creaking against the wooden floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and goosebumps rose on her arms. She trailed her fingers over the rows of tapes. The labels were strange, sometimes mundane, sometimes unnerving. Lake 1987, Factory Night Shift, Riverbank, Parade, November, Surveillance. Each name felt like a fragment of someone else's life, a piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. In the far corner stood a heavy workbench covered with tools, notebooks, and the skeletal remains of an old video camera. A small television and VCR were set up beside it, both plugged into the wall. The power indicator glowed faintly red. She touched the screen of the TV. Cold. Yet the device was alive, waiting. Her eyes scanned the shelves again until something caught her attention. A single tape that didn't match the others. It had no plastic case, no neat label. Across its black spine, in thick uneven letters, someone had written, "Watch only after my death." Her heartbeat quickened. The words looked rushed, desperate. She could almost see Harold's trembling hand as he wrote them. She turned the tape over in her hands, its plastic rough and slightly warped, as if it had been handled too often. "Mia!" Her mother's voice startled her. She nearly dropped the cassette. Karen stood in the doorway, her face half shadowed by the dim light. "What are you doing in here?" Mia hid the tape behind her back, trying to steady her breathing. "Just looking." Karen frowned, glancing around the room. "This place feels wrong. I told him to clean it years ago. He said he was working on something important. I thought he meant repairing radios or cameras, but he was obsessed. Look at all this." She touched one of the shelves, her fingers tracing the dust. "He couldn't let go of anything." Mia said nothing. Her mother turned to leave, muttering to herself about sorting things later. As soon as she was gone, Mia slipped the tape into her jacket pocket. The rest of the day passed in fragments. They sorted dishes, argued mildly about what to keep, what to throw away, all while the tape's weight pressed against her side like a secret heartbeat. When evening came, Karen went to bed early, exhausted. Mia stayed downstairs, claiming she still had a few things to finish. She turned off the lights except for the small lamp near the old television. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. She placed the tape into the VCR, her hands trembling as the machine swallowed it with a soft mechanical click. For a moment there was nothing but static, a sea of gray noise hissing softly like the whisper of the storm from the night before. Then an image appeared. Harold sat before the camera, his face pale and drawn, the skin under his eyes sagging with exhaustion. The light behind him was dim, flickering slightly. The background was unmistakable. The same garage, the same shelves that surrounded her now. He was speaking from inside this very room. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice rough but steady, "then I'm gone." The sound of his voice made her throat tighten. She had barely heard him speak in life, and now in death his words carried a strange authority, as though he had known she would listen. "I don't know who's seeing this," he continued. "Maybe my sister. Maybe Mia." He paused when he said her name, as if the thought of her were difficult. "If it's you, then I need you to listen carefully." He leaned forward slightly. The image wavered as the tape crackled. "The truth has a cost. You'll find things here you don't understand. I kept them for a reason. I couldn't speak while I was alive. They were watching." Mia's hand froze on the armrest. The house felt colder. "Everything I've hidden connects to one mistake," Harold said. "It started 30 years ago, a mistake that turned into a crime, and a crime that turned into silence." Before he could continue, the picture broke into static. For a few seconds there was only noise. Then the image returned briefly, his face close to the camera, his eyes shining with something like fear. The words, "Now the truth belongs to you," flickered across the bottom of the screen in jagged letters, as if burned into the tape itself. Then the screen went black. Mia stared at her reflection in the dark glass, her heart hammering. The old television hummed faintly, a low electric pulse that made the silence feel alive. She reached for the remote to stop the tape, but before her finger touched the button, the VCR whirred again, moving on its own. The reels spun backward, then forward, then stopped. For a split second, a new image appeared, a faint shape in the background behind Harold, a human silhouette half hidden in the shadows between the shelves. It moved just slightly, as though turning toward him. Then the screen went dark again. Mia sat perfectly still. She told herself it was just an artifact of the recording, a trick of light. But the longer she sat there, the more she felt the weight of the house pressing in around her. Outside, rain began again, light but persistent, tapping softly against the windows. The rhythm matched the beating of her heart. She ejected the tape, the mechanical click sounding unnaturally loud. The cassette was warm to the touch. She slipped it back into her pocket and turned off the television. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Her mother turned in her sleep, unaware. Mia stood in the darkness, listening. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the hills, and for the briefest moment, the red light on the VCR blinked one last time before fading out completely, as if winking at her. The air felt charged like the aftermath of lightning. She climbed the stairs quietly and lay down on the bed, her thoughts unraveling in a slow whirl of confusion and fear. Harold's words echoed in her mind. The truth has a cost. 30 years ago, a crime. But what truth? And who had been watching? Her eyes drifted toward the window. The rain traced thin silver lines down the glass. And beyond them, in the faint light of the storm, she thought she saw a figure moving near the fence too far to be sure, too silent to be real. It lingered for a heartbeat, then melted into the dark. She turned away and closed her eyes, clutching the edge of the blanket. The last thing she remembered before sleep finally dragged her under was the cold weight of the tape still hidden in her pocket, and the whisper of Harold's voice echoing like a promise she didn't want to understand. The next morning arrived wrapped in fog. It rolled down from the hills like a slow tide, filling the yard and pressing itself against the windows until the house seemed to float in a gray sea. Mia woke before her mother, her head heavy from dreams that dissolved the moment she opened her eyes. The faint smell of coffee drifted from downstairs, mixed with the metallic scent of rain-soaked air. She sat up slowly, the events of the night before creeping back to her like fragments of a half-remembered story. The tape, her uncle's trembling voice, the shadow that had moved behind him, and the phrase that still echoed in her ears. It started 30 years ago. She went down to the kitchen. Her mother was already there, staring out the window with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "Morning," Karen said quietly without turning. "The fog's thick today. I can't even see the fence." Mia poured herself coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the cup. The silence between them was filled with the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional drip from the faucet. For a while, neither spoke. Karen finally broke the stillness. "I had the strangest dream last night," she said. "Your uncle was standing in the yard, just standing there in the fog, looking toward the garage. I called to him, but he didn't answer." Mia froze mid-sip. "What did he do?" "Nothing. He just looked at me and said something I couldn't hear. Then he was gone." Karen gave a nervous laugh. "It's this house. It gets into your head. We should finish up today and leave." Mia nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the tape, about what Harold had meant by "they were watching." Who were they? And what had he seen 30 years ago that could still matter now? After breakfast, they split up to continue sorting. Karen went upstairs to the bedrooms. Mia stayed on the ground floor, drawn once again to the piles of boxes and papers that cluttered the living room. Most were filled with harmless junk-old receipts, faded manuals, envelopes addressed to companies that no longer existed. But as she worked through them, she found one box that felt different. It was older, heavier, sealed with yellowing tape, and labeled in Harold's precise handwriting, 1993, 1994. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were folders stuffed with documents and photographs. The smell of old paper filled the air. She pulled one folder out and spread its contents on the table. The first thing she noticed were photographs, grainy black and white images of an industrial building, a factory, men in hard hats, a stairwell, a shadowy corridor. Some of the photos had handwritten notes on the back in the same steady hand. "Night shift, witnessed incident, don't trust management." Mia leaned closer. The pictures had the same eerie stillness as the footage from the tape-like scenes, frozen an instant before something terrible happened. She felt a chill run through her. Her uncle's warning 30 years ago, a mistake turned into a crime, suddenly felt less abstract. She reached deeper into the box and found a small notebook, its cover cracked and soft from age. Most of the entries were brief, almost coded. Ridgewood Steel contract renewed under false pretenses. Missing worker Reed. Video copy secured. Phone call from Holden, don't answer. The name stopped her cold. Holden. Mia whispered it aloud. John Holden. The sound of it filled the room, too sharp in the quiet. She knew that name well. John Holden had been a fixture in their lives for as long as she could remember. He was the kind of man people trusted without thinking, a steady presence at family dinners, The one who drove her mother to the hospital when Mia was born? The one who always sent a card on her birthday? He had even been at Harold's funeral, standing near the front, his head bowed with solemn respect. She remembered him that day, standing in the rain beside her mother. He had seemed almost part of the family, though Harold had never spoken of him. Now, seeing his name scrawled among her uncle's frantic notes, she felt something twist inside her. She flipped through the notebook again. Holden Foreman's assistant? H trusts him. Error. Holden not who he says. The Watcher. The last entry was underlined twice, as though Harold had written it in a hurry. The ink trailed off at the edge of the page. Her pulse quickened. She gathered the photos in the notebook, placing them neatly in a pile. The world outside the windows had turned white with fog. The trees were barely silhouettes. For a moment, she had the uneasy feeling that someone might be standing just beyond the glass, hidden by the mist. "Mia," her mother called from upstairs, "can you give me a hand with these boxes?" She jumped, nearly knocking over the coffee cup. "Coming!" she shouted back, though her voice sounded strained. She quickly slipped the notebook into her jacket pocket and stacked the photos inside the folder. As she climbed the stairs, the air in the house felt heavier, the boards creaking louder than before. Karen was in the guest room, sorting through an old wardrobe. "You find anything interesting?" she asked. "Just more papers," Mia said, keeping her voice steady. Her mother smiled faintly. "He was always writing things down, lists, notes, things no one else could understand. He said he was keeping track of the truth." She shook her head. "I suppose we all have our obsessions." The rest of the morning passed quietly, but the silence between them was different now, tense, brittle. Every time the floor creaked or the wind brushed against the windows, Mia found herself glancing toward the yard. The fog made the world feel smaller, pressing everything inward. Around noon, she went downstairs to make lunch. The kitchen felt colder than before. As she filled the kettle, she noticed something strange. One of the back doors, the one that led toward the garage, was slightly ajar. She was certain she had closed it earlier. She froze, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint whistle of the kettle as it began to boil. Slowly, she crossed the room and pushed the door shut, the latch clicking into place with a sound that seemed too loud. Her mother came in moments later, rubbing her arms. "It's freezing in here. You feel that?" "Yeah," Mia murmured. "Probably just a draft." Karen sighed. "I'll make us some sandwiches. You've done enough for today." Mia nodded but couldn't sit still. Her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. The garage door loomed there, quiet and solid. The key in her pocket felt heavier than ever. Her uncle's words, his warning, the name Holden, all of it, had started to weave together in her mind, like threads forming a shape she didn't want to see. By afternoon, the fog began to lift. Sunlight pushed through in faint streaks, and for a moment the world outside seemed to breathe again. Karen decided to take a nap upstairs. Mia waited until she heard her mother's door close, then went to the living room and retrieved the tape she had watched the night before. She needed to see it again. Maybe she had missed something. Maybe there was more. She slid it into the VCR and pressed play. The screen flickered, static giving way to her uncle's face. He looked the same, tired, haunted, but there was something different in his tone this time, a gravity that pulled her closer to the screen. "If you're still watching," Harold said, "then you deserve to know the truth. I was part of something I didn't understand. 30 years ago, at Ridgewood Steel, I worked the night shift. My job was to manage the surveillance tapes, record safety inspections, keep logs. It was routine. Until one night." His eyes darted to something outside the frame, then back. "They told me to erase the recordings from February 12th. Said there was a system error. But before I did, I watched them. I saw 3 men enter the East Wing after hours. One was the foreman, 2 were outsiders. They argued with a worker named Reed. He was scared. Then one of them hit him. He fell down the stairwell. They watched him die." The words sent a chill through her. Harold's voice trembled, and he ran a hand over his face. "They dragged his body out through the loading bay. Called it an accident. The next morning, I made a copy of the tape and took it home. I thought I'd done the right thing. I didn't realize how deep it went. The police told me to forget it. The station chief said if I wanted to stay alive, I'd never mention it again. The image flickered. He leaned closer to the camera. "But I couldn't forget. They came to my house that night, told me to give it back. One of them was John Holden. He said he was just there to talk. I believed him once." He looked down, his shoulders shaking slightly. "After that, everything fell apart. My wife left. I started getting phone calls. No one ever spoke, but I knew it was them." "Ikdam." He looked up again, and for the first time his expression hardened into something almost fierce. "If you find this, you'll find the proof. It's hidden in the garage, among the tapes, the box without a label. And Mia, don't trust anyone who says they knew me well, not even Holden, especially not Holden." The image broke into static again. For a moment, a faint shape appeared behind Harold, like someone moving through the shadows. Then the screen went black. Mia sat frozen. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The name echoed over and over in her head. Holden. The man who had carried her uncle's coffin, who had hugged her mother at the funeral, who had promised to help settle the estate. A sound outside made her flinch, the crunch of gravel, soft but unmistakable. She turned toward the window. Through the fading mist, she could just make out a shape near the fence. Someone was standing there, half hidden behind the trees, watching the house. She stood slowly, her breath shallow. The figure didn't move. It just lingered for a few seconds, then melted back into the fog. Her legs felt weak. She turned off the television, the room suddenly too quiet. The dark screen reflected her own pale face, and for an instant, she thought she saw another shadow standing behind her in the reflection. But when she turned, there was nothing. Only the ticking of the clock, steady and indifferent. Mia locked all the doors before going upstairs. Her hands shook as she turned each key. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused and looked down the hall toward the garage door. The key in her pocket seemed to hum faintly, as if alive. She knew now that her uncle's paranoia hadn't been madness. It had been fear. And fear, she realized, might be the only thing keeping her alive long enough to understand the truth he'd died protecting. As she closed her bedroom door, the fog outside thickened again, swallowing the last of the light. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine started, the sound low and familiar. It faded down the road, leaving behind the echo of its departure and the feeling that the watcher at the fence would not stay gone for long. The following day began under a heavy sky that looked more like metal than cloud. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with moisture, and the smell of wet wood and rust clung to everything. The silence around the house felt different now, less peaceful, more alert, as if the place itself was listening. Mia hadn't told her mother what she'd seen near the fence the night before, nor what her uncle had revealed on the tape. Karen had enough to worry about. But the name Holden had been repeating in her head like a drumbeat ever since, refusing to fade. She made breakfast without appetite. Karen seemed distant, her movements slower, her voice quieter. She didn't ask many questions, though once she said, "I called John this morning. He said he'd stop by tomorrow to help with some paperwork about the estate." Mia felt her stomach tighten, but forced herself to nod, pretending not to care. The sound of his name spoken aloud was like a needle pricking the air. After breakfast, while her mother went out to run errands in town, Mia returned to the garage. She moved carefully, her footsteps echoing on the cold floor. The light that filtered through the small window was dim, tinged with dust. Everything was in its exact place, just as she'd left it, rows of tapes, the workbench, the television. Yet there was something strange about the silence inside, like the faint hum of electricity that comes from a machine left running somewhere unseen. She started to check the shelves one by one, scanning the labels. The names blurred together after a while, endless variations of places and dates, but on the bottom shelf behind a row of unmarked cardboard boxes, she noticed something metallic. Pulling them aside, she revealed a small gray box, the kind that might have once held tools or camera parts. Its surface was scratched, and on the lid, written in her uncle's sharp, deliberate hand, were two words. "It's her." Her pulse quickened. The lid resisted for a moment before giving way with a dry metallic click. Inside lay a single cassette, heavier than the rest, with no markings at all. The plastic was dull. The tape inside wound tightly as if it hadn't been played in years. Next to it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and stiff. She opened it carefully. There was only one sentence written there, in hurried pen strokes that pressed through the page. When she sees, it will end. For a long moment, she just stared at the words, trying to decide whether they were meant as a warning or a command. Then she looked down at the cassette again. She didn't want to touch it, but her hands were already moving. She carried it to the old television and slid it into the VCR. The static began instantly, a snowstorm of gray and white that seemed louder than before. Angry almost. Then as the noise faded, an image emerged. The setting was a factory floor, just like in the photographs she'd found. The camera trembled as though held by someone breathing hard. A few seconds later, figures appeared on screen. 2 men in suits and one in a work uniform. They were arguing, though the sound was muffled and distorted. The man in the uniform shouted something, waving his hands. Then one of the suited men raised his arm. The camera jolted. A scuffle followed, quick and chaotic, and then the worker went down, his body twisting out of sight. The person holding the camera gasped audibly and took a step forward. The image blurred as they moved. The suited men looked up sharply, one pointing toward the camera. The lens caught his face for a single clear frame. John Holden. Mia's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it. The same sharp jawline, the same calm eyes, the same faint scar near his left temple. He looked younger, but it was him. The tape crackled, the screen flickered, and suddenly the camera was moving again. Shaky, hurried, almost panicked. The picture cut in and out, showing glimpses of the factory floor, the stairwell, the body being dragged toward the loading bay. Then abruptly the screen went black. Mia reached for the stop button, but before her finger touched it, the VCR clicked on its own. The reels began to spin backward. The television came to life again, flashing frames of distorted light. For an instant, the picture froze, not on the factory but on something else. A dark corridor, maybe inside the same building, lit by a single flickering bulb. At the far end of it, a figure was standing perfectly still. It was impossible to tell who or what it was. The image wavered, the outline bending and twisting with the static. Then it moved, just a step forward, slow and deliberate. Mia's heart slammed in her chest. The sound on the tape shifted to a low, rumbling hum, almost like breathing. She ejected the cassette and stumbled back, nearly tripping over a toolbox. The machine whirred one last time and went silent. The air in the garage was cold enough to make her shiver. Outside, she thought she heard footsteps, slow, crunching over gravel. She turned toward the window, but the fog had returned, dense and white, hiding everything beyond a few feet. Then came a knock, soft, deliberate, on the door. "Mia, are you in there?" Her stomach turned to ice. The voice was familiar, smooth, calm, careful. "John Holden." She didn't answer. The doorknob rattled gently. "I saw the car," he said. "Thought I'd check on you and your mother. Everything all right?" Mia pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. She glanced at the key in the lock, but her hands were shaking too badly to reach for it. "You left the gate open," Holden continued. "You shouldn't do that out here, not safe." His voice had a softness to it that made it worse. It wasn't the tone of a man threatening, it was the tone of someone pretending not to. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said after a pause. "You don't have to open the door." Mia stayed silent. Her heartbeat was so loud it drowned out everything else. After what felt like an eternity, she heard the sound of his footsteps moving away, slow and unhurried. Then came the soft rumble of his car engine starting, the crunch of tires on gravel, and finally silence. She exhaled shakily, her whole body trembling. But when she dared to look through the window, the fog was so thick she couldn't see the end of the driveway. The sound of the car faded quickly, but something in her gut told her he hadn't gone far. When her mother returned later that afternoon, she found Mia pale and silent, sitting at the kitchen table. Karen frowned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mia forced a smile. "Just tired." Karen nodded, though her eyes lingered on her daughter a moment longer. "John stopped by, didn't he? He said he might, just to check in." Mia's heart skipped. "Did you talk to him?" "Only on the phone," Karen said. "He said he'd be back tomorrow evening. Wants to bring the inheritance documents." She began unpacking groceries, unaware of how her words landed. "It's nice of him, really. Not many people would help like that." Mia turned away, her hands clenched so tightly the nails dug into her palms. That night, the wind rose again, whistling through the trees. She couldn't sleep. The image of Holden's face on the tape burned behind her eyelids, replaying again and again. The way he had looked directly at the camera before the frame froze. The calm expression of a man who knew exactly what he'd done. She sat up, listening to the house breathe around her, the old timbers shifting, the pipes groaning, the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. Then she heard it, a faint scrape outside near the porch, followed by the whisper of gravel underfoot. Her pulse quickened. She slipped from the bed and crossed to the window. The fog had thinned just enough to reveal the outline of the gate, standing slightly open. A shadow moved past it, quick and soundless, before disappearing behind the trees. Mia backed away from the window, her breath catching. Somewhere below, a floorboard creaked. She froze. Then another sound, very faint like a fingertip brushing against the doorknob downstairs. She turned toward the hall and saw a dim glow spilling from under the door of the living room. It pulsed faintly, like the flicker of a screen. She took one cautious step, then another, until she reached the top of the stairs. The television in the garage was on. She could see the light of it through the half-open door, blue and cold against the darkness. Her hand tightened on the railing. The remote was still upstairs on the table where she'd left it. No one had turned it on. Then from inside the garage, the VCR clicked. The screen flashed, and a familiar face filled the frame. Holden, standing in the same dim light as in the tape, his expression unreadable. And just before the screen cut to black, he seemed to look directly at her through the lens, as if he knew exactly where she was standing. The house went dark. The hum of the television stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the windows, heavy and unmoving. Somewhere in that endless white, she thought she heard the faint echo of footsteps returning toward the gate. By the next morning, the fog had thinned into pale ribbons that clung to the tops of the trees before dissolving under the weak sunlight. The world looked cleaner, calmer, as though nothing had happened. But inside the house, the air was sharp with unease. Mia moved like a shadow through the rooms, barely speaking, her thoughts circling the same images over and over, the unnamed tape, the factory, Holden's face turning toward the camera, and the sound of his voice outside the garage door. It felt impossible that the same man could walk into their home and smile as if nothing had ever happened. Her mother was cheerful in that forced way people are when they are trying to keep their own fears quiet. She hummed softly as she wiped the counter, occasionally glancing out the window. "John said he'd come by tonight," she reminded her. "He wants to finalize everything. It'll be good to get that settled, won't it?" Mia didn't answer. She couldn't find a way to say what she knew. If she told her mother that the man they trusted had once helped cover up a murder, that he had threatened Harold and probably killed him too, what then? Karen would call her dramatic, paranoid, just like her uncle had been. She would insist on politeness, on gratitude. And then Holden would arrive, and it would be too late. The day stretched endlessly. They worked in silence, sorting and cleaning, the sound of paper rustling and drawers closing, filling the hours. Every time a car passed outside, Mia's pulse quickened, expecting it to stop in their driveway. Around evening, the light began to dim, and the house sank into that quiet, golden half-dark that always seemed to make time slow down. Karen stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup, her movements calm and domestic. "It's strange," she said softly, "how quickly things end. One week someone's alive, the next their house becomes a museum of dust and memories." Mia watched her, feeling a sudden, desperate tenderness. She wanted to tell her to pack up, to leave this place now before the sun disappeared. But her mother's tired eyes, full of an old loyalty to Harold, made her hesitate. Then headlights cut through the window. A car door slammed outside. Karen straightened her back, smoothing her blouse. "That must be John," she said. "Try to be polite, Mia. He's been nothing but kind." Mia didn't move. Her hands were cold. The front door opened, and his voice filled the hallway. "Evening, ladies." Smooth, warm, familiar. The kind of voice meant to put people at ease. He entered the kitchen with his usual confidence, holding a small leather briefcase. He wore a dark jacket and smiled as though he'd just come home. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. Karen shook her head and smiled in return. Not at all. We were just having dinner. You'll stay for some soup, won't you? I'd be honored, he replied. He glanced at Mia then, his expression perfectly polite but distant, like a teacher acknowledging a quiet student. You've been keeping your mother company, I see. That's good. These things can be difficult. Mia's stomach churned. Every word he spoke sounded rehearsed, practiced. He placed the briefcase on the table, unclasped it with a click, and pulled out a stack of papers bound with a blue ribbon. These are the probate documents, he explained. Just a few signatures left. Once we file them, everything will officially transfer to Karen. Karen smiled, taking the papers. You've been so helpful, John. Really? He waved a hand modestly. Harold was an old friend. I'd never leave his family to handle things alone. The words hung in the air like a bad taste. Mia felt them press against her chest, a steady, suffocating pressure. She stared at his face, at the calmness of it, at how easily he could speak of Harold without even blinking. She could almost see it now, the man from the tape, younger but no different, looking straight into the lens while a body lay cooling behind him. Her mother poured him a bowl of soup, and they sat together at the table. The conversation was light, meaningless weather, old neighbors, estate taxes, but under every word something darker thrummed. Holden's gaze wandered the room, resting briefly on the corner where the old VCR stood. At one point, he smiled faintly and said, "Still using Harold's old equipment? He was always such a stickler for documentation." His eyes flicked to Mia for just a second, and in that moment she saw it, the gleam of recognition, of knowledge. He knew she had been in the garage. He knew she'd seen the tapes. Her spoon clattered against the bowl. Karen looked up, startled. "Mia." "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. But she could feel Holden's attention, still on her, steady and calculating. When dinner ended, Karen excused herself to fetch some family papers from the study. The moment she left the room, Holden leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged but his tone softer. "You've been busy, haven't you?" he said quietly. Mia didn't answer. "Harold would have wanted you to stay out of his mess," he continued, his voice low enough that Karen couldn't hear. "He had, strange ideas near the end. You shouldn't let them take root." She stared at him. "You killed him, didn't you?" His smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Be careful with accusations like that. Your uncle was sick, paranoid. You of all people should understand how grief distorts memory." He rose from his chair, still calm, and walked to the sink, rinsing his bowl as though nothing had happened. "You're young. You don't know how dangerous the world can be when you start pulling at threads best left alone," Karen returned, holding a stack of papers. "Everything's here," she said brightly. Holden smiled, all warmth again. "Perfect," he said, taking them and packing everything neatly into his briefcase. "I'll come by tomorrow with the notary. We'll finalize it then." When he finally left, the sound of his car driving down the gravel path echoed long after the headlights vanished. That night, the house was restless. The wind pushed against the windows, making the glass tremble. Mia couldn't sleep. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the small red light on the VCR glowing faintly in the dark. Somewhere above, her mother stirred, then the floor creaked and fell silent again. A sudden crash broke the stillness. It came from upstairs. Mia jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. "Mom!" she called, but there was no answer. She grabbed the flashlight and ran up the stairs 2 at a time. Her mother's bedroom door was open. The window had been smashed inward, glass glittering on the floor. The curtains flapped wildly in the cold wind. Karen lay unconscious on the floor beside the bed, a dark bruise forming on her temple. Mia dropped beside her, shaking her shoulders. "Mom, wake up!" Karen groaned faintly, but didn't respond. Then a sound came from downstairs, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Mia's blood ran cold. She turned off the flashlight and crept to the hallway railing. From below came the slow rhythm of footsteps on the floorboards. Deliberate, unhurried. The living room glowed faintly blue. The television was on again. She crept down the stairs, her hands trembling as she gripped the railing. The static on the screen cleared and the image sharpened. It was Holden standing in Harold's garage, pouring something into a cup of tea. Her uncle's voice came faintly through the speakers, distant and trusting. Holden smiled, stirred the drink, and handed it to him. Harold drank. Moments later, his hand slipped from the armrest. The cup fell, shattering on the floor. The tape ended abruptly. The screen went black. A shadow moved near the doorway. Then Holden's voice came from the darkness, quiet and steady. "You shouldn't have watched that." Mia froze. The voice was closer now. He stepped into the dim light, his expression calm, almost regretful. "Your uncle couldn't let things go. I hoped you'd be smarter." Her breath came shallow. She backed away, but her heel hit the edge of the rug. "You poisoned him," she whispered. He sighed. "He left me no choice, and now you've made things complicated again." Before he could take another step, headlights flashed across the window. A car was pulling into the drive. Sirens followed, faint but growing louder. Holden turned sharply toward the door, his composure cracking for the first time. "What did you do?" Mia didn't answer. Somewhere in her panic, she had called 911 without even remembering pressing the numbers. Holden swore under his breath and ran for the back door, disappearing into the night. When the police burst through the front door moments later, Mia was kneeling beside her mother, holding her hand. The officers flooded the house with light, their voices echoing through the rooms. But Holden was gone. The television flickered once more before going dark. On the screen for a brief second was Harold's face smiling faintly, as if he had known it would end this way. Then the house fell silent, except for the distant hum of sirens fading into the night. The morning that followed felt unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's life. The rain had stopped, the air smelled of wet earth and ash, and thin sunlight poured through the shattered window of her mother's room. Everything inside the house seemed clearer now. Too clear, too still. The police were everywhere. Footsteps on the stairs, radios crackling, voices murmuring as they cataloged evidence and took photographs of the living room, the garage, the scattered tapes. They moved through the house like ghosts in blue uniforms, careful not to disturb more than they already had. Mia sat on the porch steps wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and distant. Her hands still trembled from the memory of Holden's voice and the way he had looked at her before running into the night. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there, staring at the muddy driveway where his car had once been. The ground bore the deep marks of tires leading away toward the road. A detective approached quietly and crouched beside her. He was a middle-aged man with calm gray eyes and a notebook half filled with scrawled lines. "Miss Lane," he said gently, "we'll need you to come down to the station later, once your mother's stable enough. But for now, I need to confirm, this is the man?" He held up a photograph taken from the security footage of the factory archives they'd already recovered from the tapes. It showed Holden as he had looked decades ago, younger but unmistakable. Mia nodded slowly. "That's him. John Holden." Her voice was steady but hollow. The detective sighed, closing the folder. "He won't get far. We've already issued the warrant. The recordings your uncle left, they're enough. You did the right thing bringing them forward." She didn't answer. The phrase echoed in her mind, the right thing. It didn't feel like that. It felt like everything around her had been stripped bare, as if truth itself had come with a price she hadn't understood until now. Karen was inside, resting on the couch, her head bandaged, still fragile but conscious. Every so often, she would look toward the door and ask softly, "Is he gone?" And Mia would nod, not trusting herself to say more. The paramedics had told her she'd be all right after a few days, but her eyes were different now, hollowed by the knowledge of betrayal. As afternoon crept in, the police began to clear out, leaving behind the quiet hum of a house that suddenly seemed too large. One officer remained behind to finish cataloging the evidence in the garage. Mia stood in the doorway watching him work, the air filled with the low, steady buzz of fluorescent lights. The garage no longer felt like a forbidden place. It was something else now, an archive, a memorial, a vault of truth built by a man who had known exactly what would come. The officer called to her after a while. "Miss Lane? You might want to see this." He pointed toward the back wall where one of the wooden shelves had been pulled away. Behind it, hidden behind a thin panel of plywood, was a small metal hatch. The latch was old but intact, secured with a few screws. Mia hesitated, then helped unscrew it. The panel fell open, revealing a tangle of wires and small monitors. 4 screens stacked together, their surfaces dark and dusty. "It's some kind of surveillance system," the officer said, leaning closer. "Looks like it was wired through the whole house. Probably your uncle's doing." Mia's breath caught. She recognized the handwriting etched faintly on one of the metal casings. "Truth waits." The officer plugged in the power cord to test the unit. After a few seconds, one of the monitors flickered to life. Grainy footage filled the small, screen-time stamped recordings from cameras placed in the living room, the kitchen, the porch. And there, in black and white, was Holden, stepping into the house on the night Harold died, holding a small glass vial in his hand. The officer let out a low whistle. "That'll do it," he murmured. "That's your murder right there." He switched off the screen and packed the evidence carefully into a box. When he left, the garage was quiet again. Mia remained there, staring at the place where the screens had been. She noticed something she hadn't before. A small drawer beneath the workbench, almost invisible, its handle worn smooth. She pulled it open and found a single cassette inside, this one carefully labeled in her uncle's familiar handwriting. "If the truth is found, play this." Her hands shook as she carried it to the VCR. The machine clicked softly as it accepted the tape, and for a moment there was only the hiss of static. Then Harold appeared on screen again, seated in the same chair, looking older than before, but calmer. His eyes, once frantic, were steady now. "If you're seeing this," he said, "then it's over. You've done what I couldn't." He smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "They say truth destroys, but really it just uncovers what's been rotting underneath. You did well, Mia, better than I did. I wanted to protect you from this, but I see now that truth doesn't choose who carries it. It simply waits for someone brave enough to open the door." He paused, glancing toward the shelves around him. "You'll find a lot of what I left behind doesn't matter, but the cameras will show you everything. Use them wisely. Don't let them become your prison as they were mine." The image flickered slightly. "If you're wondering whether it was worth it, yes. Even now, even at the cost of my life. Because you're watching this, it means the truth lives on." He leaned closer to the camera. "Goodbye, Mia." The screen went dark. The faint hum of the television lingered for a few seconds before fading into silence. She sat there for a long time, unable to move. The light outside was growing softer, the kind of gold that made even broken things seem beautiful. She thought about what he'd said, how truth didn't destroy but revealed. Maybe that was what this house had been doing all along, waiting for someone to open the right door. That evening, after the last police car had gone and the road had gone quiet again, Mia walked through the rooms one final time. The house no longer frightened her. The shadows had changed. They were just shadows now, empty of secrets. She stopped in the garage and gathered the remaining tapes into a box. Then she took one blank cassette from the pile, inserted it into the old VCR, and pressed record. The red light blinked softly in the corner of the screen, casting a warm glow on her face. She looked into the lens and spoke quietly. "If anyone ever finds this house again, know that it holds more than one story. My uncle's truth was his burden. Mine is to remember it, and to keep watching, so nothing like this happens again." When she finished, she stopped the recording, labeled the tape in careful handwriting, and set it beside the others. "Watch only after my death." The gesture felt right, a way to close the circle. She turned off the lights and stepped outside. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of rain and soil. The trees whispered faintly in the distance. For the first time in days, she felt no fear, only the weight of what had been done and the strange, quiet calm of survival. As she reached the gate, she turned back for one last look at the house. The windows reflected the dying sunlight, empty and silent. But inside the garage, unseen to her, a small red light blinked once more, steady, patient, almost like a heartbeat, before fading into darkness. Suscríbete ahora para no perderte la próxima historia. Mira a continuación los siguientes videos y continúa el misterio con nosotros. Comparte este video con tus amigos y cuéntanos en los comentarios desde dónde nos estás viendo.